And before we're going to continue, I want to take a little bit of an in depth dive about the scriptures that talk about the 10 heads and the 7 horns. I've mentioned them earlier, but I want to take a deep dive into them before we move on because this is all happening parallel to the seals and judgment. And this really also elaborates on this one world government I'm talking about. So now you've heard me say that this beast with the 10 horns and 7 heads could represent Leviathan, a gigantic sea monster, a physical being. And you've also heard me say that maybe these heads could also represent governing bodies such as political systems or the news or the music industry, etc. But there's actually one more view, and this is also the view which is commonly accepted by scholars, that this beast or this monster represents a one world government with different rulers within it. So just to refresh your mind, we see in Revelation chapter 12 verse 3, then another sign appeared in heaven, an enormous red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns on his heads. So we see a beast or a dragon with 7 heads and 7 crowns on the 7 heads and 10 horns. And the Bible actually tells us what these heads and horns really mean. So we see in Revelation chapter 17, verse 9 to 10. This calls for a mind with wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 hills on which the woman sits. They are also 7 kings. 5 have fallen, one is, the other has not yet come, but when he does come, he must remain only for a little while. So we see here the 7 heads are also called 7 mountains or 7 kings. Now, in apocalyptic prophecy, mountains are actually often used to symbolize kingdoms or empires. For example, we see in Jeremiah chapter 51, verse 25, where it refers to Babylon, but it's talking about a mountain. I am against you, you destroying mountain, you who destroy the whole earth, declares the Lord. I will stretch out my hand against you, roll you off the cliffs, and make you a burned out mountain. So, in this context, it's speaking against the kingdom of Babylon. It's not necessarily too concerned with the geographical location of Babylon in of itself. It's speaking to the kingdom in of itself, the people. And we see the same thing in Daniel chapter 2 verse 35. The iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver and the gold were all broken to pieces and became like chaff on a threshing floor in the summer. The wind swept them away without leaving a trace, but the rock that struck the statue became a huge mountain and filled the whole earth. Now, you can forget this verse. It's not relevant yet. We're going to get to it, but just remember this second sentence. But the rock that struck the statue became a huge mountain and filled the whole earth. So the rock became a huge mountain. And then in Daniel chapter 2, verse 44 to 45, we see, in the time of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor will it be left to another people. It will crush all those kingdoms and bring them to an end, but it will itself endure. This is the meaning of the vision of the rock cut out of a mountain, but not by human hands. A rock that broke the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold to pieces. So, referencing the scripture I just read to you. The great God has shown the king what will place in the future. The dream is true and its interpretation is trustworthy. So we see here that the rock struck the statue and became a huge mountain and filled the whole earth. And here we see that the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor will it be left to another people. It will crush all those kingdoms and bring them to an end. But it will itself endure forever because the rock that will take down the statue represents the kingdom of God, which is going to become a huge mountain. So in this context, mountain is also referencing a kingdom. If you're a little bit confused about these verses and what they truly mean, don't worry about that. We're going to get to that. This is just merely to illustrate that even here we see in context when we get to the explanations that this rock which tears down the statue made of gold, bronze, silver, iron, and clay is called a mountain, and this mountain is going to be the kingdom of God, which lasts forever. But we're going to get to what all of this means. But the only thing I want to illustrate here is that we see that mountains means kingdoms, and this is a consistent biblical metaphor, especially when it comes to prophetic imagery. And so we see that these 7 heads, even though they are called kings, they actually represent the kingdom in of itself, because every kingdom has multiple kings, and this is also the commonly accepted scholarly interpretation, that it's not referencing one king or one person, but the system in of itself, the kingdom in of itself, the spirit which takes a hold of the kingdom. And what's interesting is also that it doesn't just simply mention the 7 kings, it immediately gives a what appears to be a historical timeline. So see, 5 have fallen, one is, the other has not yet come, but when he does come, he must remain for only a little while. Now, if these were just seven individual kings, this timeline wouldn't make sense. But when we see them as representing successive empires, it does. When we look at them through the lens that these are kingdoms. So then the question is, well, what does it mean five are fallen, one is, and the other is not yet come? Scholars have generally interpreted that to be the kingdoms which have afflicted God's people historically. So if we look back in history, if you also remember what we've talked about earlier, there are five empires at the time of this writing that have afflicted Israel or the chosen people of God, which have fallen. So you have Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Medo Persia, and Greece. So remember, Egypt, that was where Moses led them out of captivity. Assyria and Babylon, these were also where the people were exiled. Medo Persia, remember Cyrus the Great, who sent the people back to Jerusalem to build up the temple. That was another kingdom which was oppressing or owning the people of God at that time. Obviously, God exiled them because they were disobeying. But historically speaking, these were the kingdoms that oppressed the people of God, and then Greece as well. Once they were in Jerusalem, after 332 BC, the Greeks were also in control of Israel. And now it says one is. So at the time of this writing, which was in John's day, the people of God were oppressed this time by the kingdom of Rome. But then it speaks about one more to come. And now it gets a little different because now the people are exiled all over the world. So the people of God aren't in one place. And this is why it says that there is only one more to come. And this is going to be one kingdom which oppresses all of God's people. But if all of God's people are exiled, then that has to be a sort of one world government, or else it wouldn't make sense if it's talking about one to come, because the scholarly interpretation is that this represents kingdoms that have oppressed God's people historically, right? Five have already fallen, the ones I just mentioned. One is, which was the Roman kingdom during the time of John when this was written, and then there's going to be one more. But what could that one more be if everybody is scattered all around Europe, Africa, and Asia? This would have to be a one world government, or else it wouldn't fall under the same criteria of quote unquote oppressing God's people. And when it says God's people, it's not just simply, or when I say God's people, it's not just simply meaning the physical Israel after Christ at the time of John. This would also mean all believers, and all believers are scattered. So this can't be just a singular kingdom in a singular place. This has to encompass all of them if we want to use the standard of interpretation, which is these are kingdoms which afflicted the people of God. And hence, this has to be a one world government. And that's why it's called one to come. And this one to come would then also be the final kingdom under which the ruler of the Antichrist is. So, to simplify this, if we get back to the beast, each king is shorthand for a ruling empire, headed by a king but representing the entire system. And obviously, this would contradict what I've said earlier about the heads potentially being governing bodies such as mainstream news, etc. And so, either way, I'm not here to say what it 100% definitely means, but I must admit that the heads representing past kingdoms and one more that is to come in this way is rather convincing, and most Christian scholars also share this view of the seven heads. Now, just because Christian scholars agree on an interpretation doesn't necessarily mean this is true. We have to remember that it was the religious enterprise in of itself which crucified Christ. So a little skepticism and openness is always a good idea. But this way of interpreting the beast with its head and horns, which I'm going to get to, is actually pretty convincing and most definitely deserving of a deeper dive into scriptures. And this is why we're going to do this right now. My job really is to lay out all the possible interpretations, as well as obviously the scholarly or common view. And then it is up to you to decide whichever way you want to interpret the scriptures. But interestingly enough, if we take the scholarly accepted view, this would actually perfectly fit into the picture with Project Bluebeam or using advanced technology. We're going to get to that though. So, once again, the seven heads, they represent seven kingdoms. And now let's read the scriptures of Nebuchadnezzar's vision, who was the king of Babylon at the time. So we see in Daniel chapter 2, verse 31 to 35, Your Majesty looked, and there before you stood a large statue, an enormous, dazzling statue, awesome in appearance. The head of the statue was made of pure gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of baked clay. While you were watching, a rock was cut out, but not by human hands. It struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and smashed them. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were all broken to pieces and became like chaff on a threshing floor in the summer. The wind swept them away without leaving a trace, but the rock that struck the statue became a huge mountain and filled the whole earth. Once again, we've looked at his scripture earlier. We know now what the huge mountain is that filled the whole earth. But let's go over now what this vision actually means. Because there's the interpretation in Daniel chapter 2, verse 36 to 40. This was the dream, and now we will interpret it to the king. Your majesty, you are the king of kings. The God of heaven has given you dominion and power and might and glory. In your hands he has placed all mankind, and the beasts of the field and the birds in the sky. Wherever they live, he has made you ruler over them all. You are that head of gold. After you, another kingdom will arise, inferior to yours. Next, a third kingdom, one of bronze, will rule over the whole earth. Finally, there will be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron. For iron breaks and smashes everything, and as iron breaks things to pieces, so it will crush and break all the others. Just as you saw that the feet and toes were partly of baked clay and partly of iron, so this will be a divided kingdom, yet it will have some of the strength of iron in it, even as you saw iron mixed with clay. As the toes were partly iron and partly clay, so this kingdom will be partly strong and partly brittle. And just as you saw the iron mixed with baked clay, so the people will be a mixture and will not remain united any more than iron mixes with clay. In the time of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor will be left to another people. It will crush all those kingdoms and bring them to an end, but it will itself endure forever. So we see here in verse 39, after you another kingdom will arise, inferior to yours. Next, a third kingdom, one of bronze, will rule over the whole earth. Finally, there will be a fourth kingdom of iron. So we see here that these attributes represent kingdoms. And the general interpretation is that these are the same kingdoms which it was talking about earlier about the seven kingdoms, five that have fallen, one which is, and one which is yet to come. But here we see it's only talking about five, right? After you, another kingdom, next, a third kingdom, and then a fourth kingdom. So we're in one kingdom, and then there's going to be three more, and the last one after that will be the final kingdom. This is because this was written during the time of Babylon, when they were under Babylonian rule. And so the Egyptian kingdom and the Assyrian kingdom, they have already fallen, they're already gone. So from that point of view, you would have five at that point, which would once again tie into the timeline of those kingdoms which have and will oppress God's people. So we see here in verse 32, the head of the statue was made of pure gold. And in verse 38, we see in your hands he has placed all mankind and the beasts of the field and the birds in the sky. Wherever they live, he has made you ruler over them all. You are that head of gold. So they are interpreting the dream to the king, and the king is called the head of gold because at that time he was the king of the Babylonian Empire. So his kingdom represents the gold. And then we also see again in verse 32 the chest and arms are of silver. So this will be the next kingdom. And then the belly and thighs of bronze. And then the final kingdom, the legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of baked clay. So when it says in verse 39, after you another kingdom will arise, this is going to be the kingdom symbolized by the silver in the beast, which would be Medo-Persia. And then next, a third kingdom out of bronze. This would be Greece. And then the final kingdom would be the kingdom of iron, which would be the Roman kingdom. Now, remember in the chapter of Revelation during John's time, it says one is, the other has not yet come. So the one which is the Roman Empire. But here it's talking about as if the Roman Empire was the last one. And this is because it is generally understood that the last and final kingdom will sort of be a symbolic or metaphorical revival of the Roman kingdom. And we see this in the way it is depicted. So you have the Roman Empire, which is symbolized by the legs of iron. But then we see in Daniel, verse 41 to verse 43, just as you saw that the feet and the toes were partly of baked clay and partly of iron, so this will be a divided kingdom. Yet it will have some of the strength of iron in it, even as you saw iron mixed with clay. So we see the legs, they are of iron, but feet, they aren't. We see in verse 42, as the toes were partly iron and partly clay, so this kingdom will be partly strong and partly brittle. And just as you saw the iron mixed with baked clay, so the people will be a mixture and will not remain united any more than iron mixes with clay. So the reason for that is that Rome, although it is one of the kingdoms that historically oppressed the people of God, and Rome also got conquered, Rome was never fully destroyed, unlike Babylon or Persia, for example. It morphed into other systems, for example, the Holy Roman Empire or even the Vatican influence and Western civilization in general. So the iron material continuing into the feet shows Rome's DNA still exists in that final world order. There's an intermingling. And this is why they are both depicted as iron, because they both contain elements of the Roman Empire and are partially the original Roman Empire because it has its influences all the way today because it was never ultimately destroyed. So the feet and toes are not necessarily a separate kingdom, but they are considered the final phase or the revived version of the fourth kingdom of Rome. So yes, they're a part of the Roman Empire, just a later divided and weaker form, which is understood as this seventh kingdom or the one world government. And we're also going to see this metaphor with iron in other verses, and we see this in Daniel's vision of the four beasts. And he gets at it from a different perspective. So see in Daniel chapter 7, verse 3 to 7, four great beasts, each different from the others, came up out of the sea. Remember, the beast from Revelation also comes out of the sea. The first was like a lion, and it had the wings of an eagle. I watched until its wings were torn off, and it was lifted from the ground, so that it stood on 2 feet like a human being, and the mind of a human was given to it. And there before me was a second beast, which looked like a bear. It was raised up on one of its sides, and it had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. It was told, "Get up and eat your fill of flesh." After that I looked, and there before me was another beast, one that looked like a leopard, and on its back it had 4 wings, like those of a bird. This beast had 4 heads, and it was given authority to rule. After that, in my vision at night, I looked, and there before me was a fourth beast, terrifying and frightening and very powerful. It had large iron teeth. It crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. It was different from all the former beasts, and it had 10 horns. Once again, this is at the same time during the Babylonian Empire, so the first two are falling away. So here we see the same thing. The fourth beast is also iron. This would be the Roman Empire. But then we also see it has these 10 horns, which is exactly like the beast in Revelation. And we even see in Revelation chapter 13, verse 2, and the beast which I saw was like unto a leopard, and his feet were as the feet of a bear, and his mouth as the mouth of a lion, and the dragon which gave him his power and his seat and great authority. So we see this beast contains all the previous beasts that Daniel saw in his vision. He saw a lion, he saw a beast which looked like a bear, and we saw a beast which looked like a leopard. And now the beast which comes out of the sea in Revelation contains aspects of all of those beasts. And we actually also see the interpretation of what these beasts mean in Daniel chapter 7, verse 17 to 18. The 4 great beasts are 4 kings that will rise from the earth. And so, in this way, kings is to be understood as kingdoms because it's not talking about the literal personified ruler, but it's talking about the kingdom in of itself as a whole, as a ruler, which is why the word is kings and not kingdoms. So the 4 great beasts are 4 kings or kingdoms that will rise from the earth. But the holy people of the Most High will receive the kingdom and will possess it forever. Yes, forever and ever. This is obviously after Christ comes. What we see here, the 4 great beasts, they represent kingdoms. And so the beast which comes out of the sea in Revelation has exactly the attributes of the 4 beasts Daniel saw in his vision, which all represented kingdoms. And we also see in Daniel chapter 7, verse 23 to 25, another explanation. He gave me this explanation. The fourth beast is a fourth kingdom. See, here we also see it literally says kingdom that will appear on earth. It will be different from all the other kingdoms and will devour the whole earth, trampling it down and crushing it. So we see here it will be global. It will devour and encapsulate the whole earth, trampling it down and crushing it. This final kingdom. So we see the same thing here. The beasts are kingdoms, and the last beast and the final beast contains all the previous beasts and is mightier than the beasts or kingdoms before it. I'll give you the overview once again so this is clear. We have these 7 kingdoms. We have the interpretation of the statue and the vision of the 4 beasts. The statue has its attributes, and each of these attributes makes up the whole of the statue. And the statue at the end is then finally overthrown by God. But the statue represents the final kingdom, which contains aspect or part or the previous kingdoms. And the Roman kingdom there is mentioned to be made of iron. And the final kingdom is also made of iron or has iron attributes in Daniel chapter 7, verse 7. And this is why this notion comes that this is sort of a revival of the Roman Empire, because it's both iron. And so the other vision was the four beasts which are like a lion, like a bear, and like a leopard. And then in Revelation, we see that the final beast has all of these attributes once again. So the statue, the vision of the statue, and the vision of the four beasts, they represent the same. That these kingdoms will be contained within that final kingdom, and it will also be sort of a revival of those kingdoms. But now the question is, what does it really mean that it contains the previous beasts, or that the final beast contains the previous beasts, or in other words, that the final kingdom contains the previous kingdoms? This could imply many things. Maybe there was a special corrupt aspect to each of these kingdoms, something specific, and this last one will contain all of those. Or maybe there was a certain way Satan influences them, and in the final one, he will combine all of them into the ultimate rulership. And what would the ultimate kingdom be? In the eyes of Satan, one which worships him. Because what he desires more than a false religion or a nation in paganism is a nation that worships him. Remember, I told you this earlier. What was Lucifer's highest desire? To be like God, to be worshipped as God. And, well, spoiler alert, this is then also what comes. The Antichrist will eventually proclaim himself to be God, which is going to be Satan embodied, who wants to be worshipped by the people. But we're going to get there. We're still in the first 3.5 years. And now, if we go back to Daniel chapter 7, verse 23 to 25, we see here that in verse 24, it's now talking about the horns. The 10 horns are 10 kings who will come from this kingdom. After them, another king will arise, different from the earlier ones. He will subdue 3 kings. He will speak against the Most High and oppress his holy people and try to change the set times and the laws. The holy people will be delivered into his hands for a time, times, and half a time. So we see here that the 10 horns, they are 10 kings who will come from this kingdom. So when we have this revived kingdom which will span over the whole earth and oppress all of God's people, this kingdom will have 10 kings that will be rulers within that kingdom. And so now we know the 7 heads, they represent 7 mountains, or in other words, 7 kingdoms. And the 10 horns, they represent 10 kings. And the final beast is the one which has the 10 horns. And the final beast is also the one which contains all the previous beasts or all the previous aspects of the statue, right? It is the unity of all of them. It is the unity of all previous corrupt societies. So this final kingdom, which is going to be the revived Roman Empire, whatever that exactly means, is going to be global, and it's going to have 10 kings. And in Revelation chapter 17, verse 12 to 13, it says, "The 10 horns you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received a kingdom, but who for 1 hour will receive authority as kings along with the beast. They have one purpose and will give their power and authority to the beast." So these kings who will rule the last kingdom will not have been rulers before. These can't be global leaders you see nowadays. It says they haven't been rulers before. They have not yet received a kingdom, but they will receive authority for only an hour, which implies for a very short time. So if we assume tribulation could come within, let's say, the next few years or decades, because we've already established that the only thing missing is the red heifer and the rebuilding of the third temple. If we can at least pin it down to the next few years or decades, this means that none of these kings will be rulers that are rulers right now. They would all have to be new ones. And so, since this is during tribulation and the final beast or kingdom or rule comes out of the sea in the first 3.5 years, this means that during those wars, you will have 10 new figures that haven't been world leaders before, who will, together with the Antichrist, who poses as the Jewish Messiah, rule the earth underneath this united kingdom. So, when all those wars happen, right, when a fourth and a third of humanity dies, and you have all of these signs and famines, this is where these 10 kings will arise. And during the first 3.5 years, the world isn't yet united. The first 3.5 years are here to unite the whole world underneath one government. And once that is done, eventually the Antichrist will reveal himself. But this is the point of those 10 figures. So when these 10 rulers will be revealed, the world won't be 100% united yet. But they will make sure of that because eventually these 10 rulers will actually give up, or these 10 kings, right? The 10 horns. They will eventually give up their authority to the Jewish Messiah, who will then make himself to be God in the middle of tribulation. You have to ask yourself, and this is something which the Bible doesn't really explain because I'm sure you've noticed by now there's a lot of symbolic and encrypted messaging in these scriptures, especially when it comes to the horns and the heads. Isn't it weird how, despite there being a literal Messiah from one of the biggest world's religion on earth, despite that there are still 10 other kings who will be on equal rank as the Antichrist? Right? You would think if the literal Judaic Messiah comes, that people will mass convert to Judaism, that they will esteem him above others because, oh my God, it's a Messiah of one of the biggest world religions. Surely this means Judaism is right. But apparently this isn't happening. And the Bible doesn't really give an account for why this is happening. It doesn't tell us why the Antichrist isn't held to higher esteems in the first 3.5 years. That he's merely just another king or ruler during that time. This is where you have to ask yourself, what about Serge Monast? What about Project Bluebeam? What if during those wars you will have holographic messiahs? What if these 10 kings are 10 figures of the 10 biggest religions that will appear in the heavens, and people out of the desperation because they're in war and famine will worship and follow? This would also explain why you won't have a single world leader which is present right now, or known right now, who is going to be one of those 10 rulers. They're all going to be replaced by these new 10 rulers who will appear all at the same time during those wars. What if these are those figures talked about by Serge Monasque, these holographic messiahs? And this is why the whole world is not already gonna, quote unquote, hold the Antichrist or the Jewish Messiah to a higher level. Because every religion has their Messiah now, and every religion is following their own Messiah. Could this be part of that great deception? Because you have to ask yourself, once again, as a spoiler, the whole world is going to worship the Antichrist in the middle point of tribulation. But you have to ask yourself, how could that be? How would you bring people from all types of religions to worship the Antichrist in the middle of those 3.5 years if their own peoples haven't come yet? Right? For example, Islam, they're waiting for the Mahdi. Christianity, waiting for the second coming of Christ. And obviously, Judaism, they're waiting for their Messiah. If none of these figures appear, people wouldn't believe the Antichrist or worship him. But if all of these religions' final figures appear in the sky with convincing wonders and signs to deceive even the very elect, and then they merge into one, or they merge into the final figure or the Antichrist, or they all give up their authority for the Antichrist, that would make people worship the Antichrist. As we see this, I've read through the scriptures earlier, we see here about these 10 kings. They have one purpose and will give their power and authority to the beast. So they will willfully subdue themselves in order for the Antichrist to then come and take over. So once again, it's at the very least a possibility. And it will explain this mystery or this question which isn't answered, which I find to be of importance. The fact that you can have a literal Judaic Messiah, but yet the people don't hold him to a higher esteem than other rulers. If these are just merely simply world rulers like Putin or Trump or whatever, or similar figures of that caliber, they would probably hold the Judaic Messiah to a higher esteem. But they don't. So they must be of equal importance or authority in the eyes of people. And then here's the interesting thing. We see in Revelation chapter 13, verse 1, the beast out of the sea. The dragon stood on the shore of the sea, and I saw a beast coming out of the sea. It had 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 crowns on its horns, and each had a blasphemous name. Now, this is very subtle. But earlier we saw that the 7 crowns were on the 7 heads. But now the kings, these 10 rulers, these 10 figures which appear during those wars in the first 3.5 years of tribulation, they are now wearing the crowns. So, what does the crown represent? Why does the crown shift from these kingdoms to these 10 rulers now? Because the authority will be given to these 10 rulers or figures. And we see the crown representing authority in a lot of scriptures. For example, in Revelation chapter 6, verse 2. I looked, and there before me was a white horse. Its rider held a bone, and he was given a crown, and he rode out as a conqueror bent on conquest. So we see here, he's given a crown, one of the horsemen, the one who is bent on conquering. Or we also see in Revelation chapter 9, verse 7, the locusts looked like horses prepared for battle. Remember, these are the ones tormenting the people after the bottomless pit is opened. On their heads, they wore something like crowns of gold, and their faces resembled human faces. So, for those 5 months, they are wearing crowns. Once again, crowns as a symbol of power. And we also see in Revelation chapter 4, verse 10, the 24 elders fall down before him who sits on the throne and worship him who lives forever and ever. They lay their crowns before the throne. So here we see as well, the elders, they cast their crowns, their symbol of authority before God and humble themselves. And even Christ himself is wearing the crown, and you also will receive the crown of life once you overcome. So we see the crown resembles authority or power. And so once these 10 rulers come, this is where the authority or power shifts to these 10 rulers. And so then the goal of these 10 rulers is to unite the governments because they have a mission, they have a purpose. Remember, they have one purpose and will give their power and authority to the beast. That is their purpose, to bring rise to the Antichrist, because they're all part of the enemy. Even though they might be posing as our saviors in whichever way, if they're messianic figures or simply just rulers, they will pose as our saviors but are actually empowered by Satan and the beast itself. Their only job is to bring about that one world government so that they can then step into the background and all point to him and be like he is the one. And we also see this, and this is a pretty interesting one, in Daniel chapter 7, verse 8. While I was thinking about the horns, there before me was another horn, a little one, which came up among them, and 3 of the first horns were uprooted before it, or uprooted, replaced, destroyed. A horn had eyes like the eyes of a human being, and a mouth that spoke boastfully. So once again, the horns are kings. So 3 kings will be replaced by this final king being the Antichrist. What could these 3 horns be? It is unknown, but if we assume that these 10 kings or 10 horns could be 10 messianic figures who will be the heads of the 10 biggest religions in the world, couldn't it be that the Antichrist will replace the Judaic, Islamic, and Christian messiahs or figures? And then once he has replaced those 3 and is looked at as the ruler of those 3, that's where he then also quote unquote overcomes or receives the authority of every other religion, because you have the 3 main religions, right? They're all Abrahamic religions. They all stem from the same prophets and history. They make up like 75 to 80% of all people on the planet. So is this what this could mean? Once again, this is just speculation. But he will replace 3 of those 10 kings. But eventually, as we see, they will all subdue themselves and give rise to the Antichrist. So their reign will be very short-lived, right? Just for 1 hour. Again, signaling very short time. And they have only one purpose. And that will be to give their power and authority to the beast. And then this, during those 3.5 years, when all the seals are opened, where all the trumpets are opened, where all the 10 rulers are officially established as the 10 rulers of the whole earth, this is then where they will unite and give their authority to the Antichrist, who will then proclaim himself to be God and the ultimate ruler of this whole system. But before we get to that, I just quickly want to go over one more aspect of this symbolism with the beast with you, because we actually see a woman riding the beast as well. So in Revelation chapter 17, verse 1 to 5, we see, and there came one of the 7 angels which had the 7 vials, and talked with me, saying unto me, Come hither, I will shew unto thee the judgment of the great whore that sitteth upon many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth have been made drunk with the wine of her fornication. So he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness, and I saw a woman sit upon a scarlet coloured beast, full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. And the woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet colour, and decked with gold and precious stones and pearls, having a golden cup in her hand, full of abominations and filthiness of her fornications. and upon her forehead was a name written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. So we see that on this beast, on this system, on the head of this one world government with these 10 rulers is sitting this whore, which is called Mystery Babylon, the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. The general scholarly interpretation is that she represents a false religious system, which is spiritually adulterous and corrupt. She rides the beast with 7 heads and 10 horns, showing her partnership with the Antichrist's political empire. Well, how do they get to that conclusion? This is because she is called a whore, and adultery is often used as a metaphor for idolatry or spiritual cheating, so to speak. So we see, for example, Israel is constantly called a harlot when they turn to idols. And this also sets this pattern of using the word whore as a metaphor to represent spiritual unfaithfulness. So we see in Ezekiel chapter 16, verse 30 to 32. I am filled with fury against you, declares the sovereign Lord, when you do all these things, acting like a brazen prostitute. When you build your mounts at every street corner and made your lofty shrines in every public square, you were unlike a prostitute, because you scorned payment. You adulterous wife, you prefer strangers to your own husband. God directly calls Israel a harlot and adulteress, not because of sexual sin, but because of idolatry and abandoning God. Same in Hosea chapter 1 verse 2. The beginning of the word of the Lord by Hosea. And the Lord said to Hosea, Go, take unto thee a wife of whoredoms and children of whoredoms, for the land hath committed great whoredom, departing from the Lord. So we see here God telling them, look, you're already adulterers, you're already unfaithful and idolaters, you might as well go get yourself a harlot. The wife of harlotry in this context symbolizes Israel's unfaithfulness to God through idolatry. And we see the same in Hosea chapter 4 verse 12. My people consult a wooden idol, and the diviner's rod speaks to them. A spirit of prostitution leads them astray. They are unfaithful to their God. Or Hosea chapter 5 verse 4, their deeds do not permit them to return to their God. A spirit of prostitution is in their heart. They do not acknowledge the Lord. This is all talking about idolatry, spiritual unfaithfulness. And so this is where this notion comes from, that if the whore which sits on the beast is called the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth, she is the ultimate embodiment of false religions, paganism, and idolatry. And so, in a more literal context, this would be a false religious system which just accepts coexistence and everybody's allowed to worship who they want and they all sort of come together as one, but yet they are still divided in some sense. And this is why she's called Babylon the Great. Because in scripture, Babylon is also often the archetype of rebellion against God, both in religious and political ways. So, Mystery Babylon could be symbolic of a system more than a literal city. She is called the mother of prostitutes, meaning she births false worship systems globally. And mystery could also suggest some hidden spiritual significance. It's not just literal Babylon, but a spiritual Babylon, encompassing all false religions under one umbrella. And then we see in Revelation chapter 17, verse 3, that she is sitting on the beast. She is not the beast, but she is using the beast, which once again is a political system or one world government for her own power. This implies she's a separate but allied entity and commonly understood to be a religious system propped up by these political rulers or messianic figures, potentially. And this alliance mirrors also exactly what a lot of scholars believe will be the coexist religion of the end times, a temporary tolerance of all faiths united under false peace. Until then, obviously, the Antichrist takes over fully. So we see in Revelation chapter 17, verse 1, that she sitteth upon many waters. And we actually have the explanation of this in Revelation chapter 17, verse 15, where it says, the waters that you saw where the prostitute is sitteth are peoples, multitudes, nations, and languages. So once again, this shows she rules over the world. This is not just some local or regional thing. This is global. And once again, this also aligns with the idea of a global religious movement, which will appeal to many different people, hence the coexist style pluralism. And we see in Revelation chapter 17, verse 6, I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints, the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. So this seems to imply that this false religious system will persecute the true believers. This is why she's drunk with the blood of the saints. So she's not just idolatrous, she is also hostile to true biblical Christianity, which does not fit in a system where everybody accepts everything. But then here's the interesting part. At the end, she is actually destroyed. This religious unity, this coexisting way of living is actually destroyed by the 10 kings, by the 10 rulers. So we see in Revelation chapter 17, verse 16 to 17, and the 10 horns will hate the prostitute and burn her with fire, for God has put it in their hearts to give their kingdom to the beast. Once again, we talked about this. Their only purpose is to give power and glory to the Antichrist. So if they are, for example, the heads of each of these religious sects that make up the coexist religion, if they are each the heads of one of these sects of religions, so for example, Islam, Judaism, Sikhism, Buddhism, Hinduism, if they then all step back and give their power to the Antichrist, and that was their whole deal or mission from the begin with, then it makes sense why they hate the prostitute, why they hate the very system they propagate themselves, because it's only a means to an end. They need to first bring us all together in the name of unity. And then once the people, respective from every religion, worship or revere their own individual figure, because once again they're held to the same esteem as the Judaic Messiah, once that has happened, these figures could then all point their fingers to the Antichrist and then step into the background. And then at that point, it's like, okay, well, people are gonna worship the Antichrist. And so we see the 10 horns will hate the prostitute and burn her with fire. For God has put it in their hearts to give their kingdom to the beast. This is their mission. They're merely using this unity as a means to bring out the Antichrist and receive favor in the eyes of people. And then this is where we get to the middle of tribulation, where the Antichrist reveals himself as God himself. And we see this in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 3 to 4. Don't let anyone deceive you in any way, for that day will not come until the rebellion occurs and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the man doomed to destruction. He will oppose and will exalt himself over everything that is called God or is worshipped, so that he sets himself up in God's temple, proclaiming himself to be God. So, in the middle of those 3.5 years, when all those rulers step into the background and the government is united, all of these rulers will point to him and he will sit in the temple that the Jews built and proclaim himself to be God. And this is also, by the way, where the Jews are then going to realize that this wasn't actually their Messiah.